Hey CW Apes, Mr. Kennedy here. This is part 2 of your Chapter 8 lecture notes on sustaining biodiversity. In part 1, we spent a lot of time talking about restorative measures or strategies that can be used to bring biodiversity back to an area that has been impacted by some sort of human activity or other environmental degradation. And as I talked to you about those things, one of the things that I pointed out was that, well, if you have high biodiversity and high species abundance, at the end of the day, well, the ecosystem oftentimes can tolerate and put up with just about whatever we throw at it and bounce back beautifully. Nature is resilient, and if we have those two factors in play, sometimes all we need to do is just stop whatever we were doing to mess things up and then let nature heal. Here's a case in point. Back when I was a boy living in Vermont in the 1840s, early settlers clear-cut the land to raise large flocks of sheep. Sheep at the time were used for food. Their, wool was used for a variety of textiles and other things that were needed in day-to-day lives, like everything from sailcloth to clothing. So as the herds got bigger, well, the settlers cut down forest and moved the herds through to keep them fed. Eventually, thank goodness, the early settlers realized that, well, there was an error in their way or method of madness, so to speak, and the forest was disappearing. They kind of shifted gears in what they valued, stopped pushing the sheep through the forest and slashing and burning, and lo and behold, since the forest, even in its reduced state, was still healthy, it recovered all by itself. It took decades in order for that to happen, but it happened because a healthy ecosystem, the healthy ecosystem that remained, was left to basically heal itself after removing the thing that was causing all of the damage. That's pretty cool. Today, 80% of the land in the Vermont forest is forested, and a lot of those lower life forms that left when all of the damage was occurring, well, they've come back, and that's fantastic for the ecosystem as a whole. So moose and bear and pine marten, bobcats, they're all back. The state of Vermont values its forests so much now that they've actually passed laws that prohibit just, clear cutting of any kind. Professional foresters are required when any logging company wants to go in and remove timber, and developing plans have to be put in place, like a development plan, so that the foresters know, like, this is where you're going to drive, and this is how much wood we're going to take out, and this is like the footprint that we're going to leave behind, and when we're done and like we come out, we're not going to leave a mess behind. Like those plans all have to be put into place before you're allowed to go in. In my past lecture, we realized that there were a lot of benefits to trees, to a forest as a whole, okay? And when you think about like the overall benefits of the forest, well, trees improve our air quality, they provide shade for cooling, they provide habitat for wildlife. The list could go on and on and on about like why trees are important, but let me just put it to you this way. Trees, plants in general, they're the base or the foundation of every single food chain that's out there. So by restoring plant life, you open the door for all other life to move in. Let's take a look at a case in point of a tree that's really, really important to its ecosystem and, experiencing a lot of stress. Here's the oak savanna. A little background on the oak savanna. The oak savanna is a forest with scattered open-grown trees where the canopy covers about 10 to 50% of the area, and then there's grasses everywhere else. The most common tree is a tree that is referred to as the fire-adapted bur oak. So I bet you can guess where I'm going with this, right? A fire-adapted bur oak. So fire must come into play here at some point. Let's see what happens. In terms of the oak savanna, fire is actually an essential tool for savanna restoration. As the savanna is, well, degraded and damaged by human activities, we lose hectare after hectare getting to the point where there's very, very little left any longer. The savanna actually used to cover, well, areas between the Great Plains and the deciduous forests of the eastern United States. Wisconsin alone had 2 million hectares, and now there's less than 0.01% left. It's really hard to restore the oak savanna once it's gone because it's maintained by fire, and one of the things that humans don't like, well, is wildfire. Right? So anytime, there's an opportunity for a prairie fire or a forest fire of any kind, we're very adept at suppressing that. And in this one instance, along with some others, well, that can be devastating for the ecosystem as a whole. In terms of prairie grove restoration, you can see that, well, as we monitor change over time, we're losing species, we're losing biodiversity at an alarming rate, right? The sheer numbers of individuals and the diversity of the individuals that exist in this area is going down and flatlining, okay? Land managers have now recognized fire as a key factor in maintaining and restoring a lot of different forest types. So as unpopular as it is to have, forest fire smoke or to see that blackened landscape, well, we're trying to allow natural fires to burn. There are some species of trees that cannot reproduce without their seeds being heated. And the same can be true in places like the oak savanna. So we're letting fires burn. In places like the Superior National Forest in Minnesota, they've actually started a program of prescribed fires to maintain the complex forest structure and remove a lot of the understory. By suppressing fire, well, the understory builds up, and then, if there ever was a fire, rather than just, burning the understory and recycling the vegetation at that level, everything is wiped out. That's what we're trying to avoid. There are even periodic prescribed burns to protect the ancient sequoias in our state, California. Before European settlement, the eastern edge of the Great Plains, it was covered by an ecosystem that, well, you've probably seen on television, but maybe not in person. There's this movie that was, I want to say, out in like the 90s, well, called Dances with Wolves. And it's all about a guy who basically goes to live with Native Americans on the Great Plains, and he learns their ways and gets to experience these tall grass prairies. These tall grass prairies, for all intents and purposes, have been virtually wiped off the face of the earth for reasons that we talked about with the oak savanna. The tall grass prairie used to have bunch grasses that could grow as high as 6 feet tall. Less than 2% remains. These tall grass prairies and like gentle rolling hills are great farmland with really rich topsoil. So guess what? All of that area was turned over for farming, right? And now, yes, we have America's breadbasket that produces vast quantities of food to feed the people of this country, but the trade-off was you're going to lose these grasslands and any of the native species, whether it be plant or animal, that belong there. So the middle of the Great Plains actually contained a mixed prairie of bunch and sod-forming grasses. The western edge of the Great Plains, with less rainfall, was covered with short grass prairies and a bunch grass that maybe only grew a foot in height, right? All of these prairies were maintained by grazing, and it wasn't grazing from cattle, it wasn't grazing from sheep, it was grazing from things like the buffalo, which also was virtually wiped out and only living in a few small herds on nature preserves like Yosemite National Park. Okay, this will kind of give you an idea of how those prairies and grasslands used to look as we course across the country. Now, with regard to restoring prairies, again, fire is also crucial to bringing them back. In 1934, Aldo Leopold began to recreate tall grass prairies on abandoned farms in Madison, Wisconsin. One of the things that he discovered as he was recreating these things was how important fire was. fire would kill weeds and remove soil kill weeds that basically came in and removed soil nitrogen and made it hard for native species to survive. So by killing these weeds and removing the soil nitrogen, the native species could now have an advantage. The problem is, well, what if the fires burned out of control? They could risk spreading to human structures, and again, nobody likes the smoke, so we worked very hard to suppress them. The Nature Conservancy has a tall grass prairie northwest of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Just again, give you an idea of how important fire is, 1/3 of each pasture is burned every year to keep the grassland healthy and give bison a place to live. This just kind of gives you an idea of the Curtis Prairie in Wisconsin and what it looks like. The Shortgrass Prairie is also being preserved. The middle of the Great Plains, well, it's fertile cropland, and that's where the shortgrasses used to live. In order to support crops, we've been pumping water out of the ground at an alarming rate from an underground lake bigger than all of the Great Lakes combined, called the Okalala Aquifer. As the water's depleted, well, it not only creates drought conditions on the edge of the aquifer, but it brings up salts and other things to the surface. So that can create a problem for raising crops and for even restoring the landscape back to its original, grassland. Human population, it's continuing to grow in these areas. There's big cities. They just keep tapping into this aquifer. When water becomes scarce, the aquifer runs dry, then people move and migrate where they can find water. Some believe that the best use of this land really isn't for cities. It's not for farming. It's not, so that, we can just grow food or whatever. It's basically just to return it to a buffalo commons, right? And let that relationship between the grass and the buffalo and fire maintain the area throughout the centuries. The Shortgrass Prairie is also being worked on in Montana. The Nature Conservancy bought the Matador Ranch, but permits ranchers to use the land in exchange for agreements to protect things like prairie dogs, sage grouse, and to control weeds and allow fire. The American Prairie Foundation is constantly buying land, pulling out fences, eliminating buildings, and trying to return the land to wilderness. There's even plans to restore elk, bison, wolf, and grizzly bear in these preserves. Locals resent the reintroduction of predators and of outside funding. If you think of it this way, if I start reintroducing wolves, now I have to be concerned about, well, what happens if wolves leave this unfenced area and decide to, eat my sheep, right? That's a serious concern for ranchers that, live in these areas. So that's where the resentment comes from. This kind of gives you an idea of how much prairie land is being restored in Montana and what it might look like if we can return bison to the area. Bison aren't like cows. They are adapted to harsh climates, so they can tolerate hot, dry seasons in the prairie. They can tolerate snow. They're kind of like the best animal for the area. So why not let them have it, okay? That brings us to wetlands and streams. Wetlands and streams provide ecological services through the hydrologic cycle. They provide food, habitat for a variety of species. Probably the most important thing that you're ever going to hear me say is that last bullet, because that's something that shows up on FRQs all the time. What do wetlands do along our coastline? Well, they absorb things like storm surge and create kind of a natural filtration for fresh and salt water where they meet and make estuaries. Super, super important idea. Wetlands occupy less than 5% of land, but 1/3 of endangered species spend at least part of their life cycle here. So we need to protect them lest we lose 1/3 of all of these species that are already on the brink. Up until the 1970s, the government gave incentives to actually drain and destroy wetlands. The idea was that these wetlands were harboring disease-causing organisms like mosquitoes, so we wanted them drained. Fortunately, since the 1970s, we've realized the error in our way, and that practice has stopped. This is what a wetland might look like in the olden days, or in an area that has been restored. Okay. To restore those wetlands, there have been a variety of bills and acts passed. One that's really important is the Clean Water Act of 1972, which began protecting streams and wetlands from pollution. The Farm Bill Act of 1985 blocked agricultural subsidies to farmers who damaged wetlands. So basically, farmers, they get paid by the federal government for all kinds of things. And the idea is that those payments or subsidies would be stopped if it could be proved that a farmer somehow damaged a wetland through, fertilizer, pesticide runoff, or whatever. Many states now have a no net loss policy, and wetlands, as a result, are starting to bounce back. There's still an imbalance when we think about rivers, lakes, streams, and wetlands. Swamps, well, they're still drained and replaced by small ponds. No net loss, but not the same ecosystem, okay? Swamps are still thought of as those areas that maybe harbor disease-causing organisms like mosquitoes, so they're still not real popular, but maybe that'll change. Restoring water supplies is also important. Restored water supplies can be diverted elsewhere. In marshes in Iraq, the water from the marshes in Iraq basically is being diverted into cities. Okay, Everglades. The water in Everglades, from ditching, draining, and diverting water started over a century ago in order to get cropland and prevent flooding in cities. The Everglades are being drained at an alarming rate. Rivers were straightened and basically, shunted water directly out to the sea instead of being allowed to meander. Not good when it comes to, restoring an ecosystem. You want to restore the ecosystem, stop diverting the water. Let the water mosey, so to speak. Don't funnel it into ditches or canals. Okay? To restore the Everglades, well, like I said, you can't keep draining them. The Everglades National Park has actually lost 90% of its wading birds, and its ecosystem is collapsing because of all of the drainage. Plans to remove, levees, restore the natural course of rivers, and save water in underground aquifers are steps that are being taken to help preserve the Everglades. There was a plan announced in 2000. Well, it's now over budget and behind schedule, but at least there's a plan in place. We just have to make it happen. This kind of gives you an idea of what the thought process is in restoring the Everglades. So rather than continuing to straighten rivers and canal the flow of water and drain the space, Floridians are starting to realize how important that meandering river might be into maintaining biodiversity, and all those plans to straighten things have been thrown out the window. Florida gets hit by probably more hurricanes than any other part of the United States, which is probably why it's one of their college mascots. But anyways, having the Everglades there is huge to protect Floridians from storm surge, and again to harbor all manner of life in those estuaries where fresh and salt water meet. Another vital estuary that we need to think about is the Chesapeake Bay. I've actually seen the Chesapeake Bay. It's America's largest and richest estuary. There's 2,700 species that basically spend all or part of their lives in or near the bay. And it's constantly suffering from pollution and degraded water supply. There was a point in the history of the Chesapeake Bay where the oysters that can be found on the bottom in conjunction with the eelgrass could actually filter the entire contents of the bay multiple times a day and keep it fairly clean. But with all the pollution, they just simply can't keep up anymore. Damage is due to overfishing, sewage discharge, silt from erosion, heavy metals, toxic chemicals, heat from industry, pesticides, herbicides, and even oil spills. This just kind of give you an idea of one step that's being taken to restore the Chesapeake Bay in restoring dunes and controlling the movement of sand. Obviously, if we can stop all of those other things that I mentioned, right? If we can stop the overfishing, stop the sewage discharge and silt from erosion and heavy metals and things like that, then we're going to give the Chesapeake Bay its best chance at survival. Alright guys, I'm Mr. Kennedy. This is part 2 of your notes on sustaining biodiversity. I hope you've learned a little bit about some of the ecosystems that are, well, under stress and duress from humans, why their biodiversity is important, and what we can do to protect it. I'll see you next time.